It was in December 1961 that a man traveled to Liverpool, England to hear a new band play. He decided that they had talent, and so he invited them to come to his studio for an audition. And when they arrived, they played for about 2 hours, about 14 songs. And then they went home. And they waited for some weeks, waited and waited to hear whether or not the studio would be interested in signing them to the label. And after a few weeks, finally, the man called and spoke to the band's manager and said, "We're really not interested in this band. They sound a lot like other bands out there." And in one of the most famous rejection lines in history, he said this, "Not to mince words, Mr. Epstein, but we don't like your voice sound. Groups are out. Four-piece groups with guitars, particularly, are finished." That group was the Beatles. They went on to be signed by EMI Records and became probably the most famous best-selling band of all time. Choices are funny that way. The choices we make impact everything. I mean, that was a horrible choice, wasn't it? That record company ended up actually helping the company that signed the Beatles eventually handle the sheer volume of music that they had to do, but they could have owned the rights to all the music. We make choices every day. We make them in our jobs, we make them when we get out of bed and decide what color socks to put on. Come see the youth group sometimes. They can't make up their minds, so they wear two different kinds of socks. Choices are part of our lives. We choose whether to go out, to stay in. We choose what jobs to have. We choose who to spend our time with, how to spend our time. We make choices constantly. And we're first introduced to Abram, later known as Abraham, in Genesis chapter 12. And he's a man whose choices literally are pivotal in the course of history itself. It's a man that makes choices, sometimes to listen to God and sometimes to go his own way. And his choices can teach us much about what is important. If you look at Genesis 12 just briefly with me, you'll find out that Abram's choices are very interesting. He comes from a land that has many gods, that has many idols. They serve all kinds of different people. And yet somehow in the midst of the noise, Abram hears God's call. And God says, "Go to the land that I will show you." And Abram chooses to go. And then later on, we find him arriving in a new land, and the first thing he does when he arrives in the new land is he chooses to call on this God who called him out to go to a new place. Abram understands that if God can call on him, that he has the privilege, the opportunity to call on God. But then later in chapter 12, you see that in verse 10, there's a famine that strikes the land God has taken him to. Now, Abram knows God has provided a place for him. Abram knows that he's allowed to call on God. But when the famine comes, he doesn't call on God. He chooses to run, to go somewhere else other than where God has called him to go. He goes to Egypt. And while he's in Egypt, while he's on his way to Egypt, rather, he looks at his wife, Sarai, a beautiful woman. Apparently she was spectacular. She was something to look at. And he says to her, "I'm worried about what's going to happen when we get to Egypt. I think the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, might want to have you as his wife because you're so beautiful. And so here's what I want you to do, Sarah. I want you to lie and tell everybody that you're my sister so they won't kill me and try to get you." And she agrees to do that. She gets to the land of Egypt and Pharaoh looks at her and says, "Yeah, she's a good-looking woman. I want her for my wife. Tell you what, Abram, I'm going to give you all kinds of flocks. I'm going to give you sheep and goats and cattle. I'm going to buy your sister. I'm going to give you the dowry so that I can marry her." And Abram accepts. He takes the wealth that Pharaoh gives him. And Sarai goes to be in Pharaoh's house. Of course, the Pharaoh, we know, if you remember the story, his family and his household and himself are afflicted with a disease. And he realizes that something's not right. He recognizes the signs. And so he calls Abram in and says, "Why did you lie to me? Your God is punishing you for taking your wife." Isn't it interesting? God had to speak through Pharaoh, the one that didn't follow him, to get through to Abram. So we find ourselves at the start of chapter 13 with Abram having been escorted by Pharaoh's troops to the border and said, "Get out and stay out." That's how the story goes. The Pharaoh says, you can take what I've given you, but I don't want your God, because I don't want your God to kill me or to punish my family anymore, so take what you got and get out. Take your wife and get out. That's what he says. And at the start of chapter 13, we see Abram make another choice. What does he do? It says he went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. It should really say back into the Negev. That's where they came from. See, when Abram makes choices, we find out things that are interesting about how God works. We find out who God is. But we also find out how we can relate to Him better. And when we make choices, friends, especially when we make bad choices, like the man who didn't sign the Beatles, sometimes we forget that the best way to correct a mistake, to fix a wrong choice, is to go back to the beginning, to return to where you came from. Abram had lied. God had made him a promise, and Abram doubted it. God had offered him a future, and he walked away. But Abram understood, even after the lie, that he could return. And I know people all the time that say, I've gone too far. God won't accept me anymore. If you knew what I'd done. Well, the story of Abram teaches us that we can return. We have permission to try again. That's the best news I've heard, because I make mistakes all the time. I was thinking back when I taught my son to ride his bicycle, and we lived in Forest, Ontario. And you talk about trying again, there was a determined young fellow. Because we had a big hill in our backyard, it was covered with grass, and I came up with the theory, this being a dad thing, right? Guys, you know what I'm talking about. That the best way to teach my son to ride would be to put him on the bike at the top of the hill and throw him down it. Right? That's how we, just like guys that teach their kids to swim by tossing them in a pond. This is how guys think. And so I put him on the bike and I fired him down the hill. And predictably, he fell off. And his little legs tried to go, but they couldn't figure out how to coordinate the pedals and steering and balancing all at the same time. So what did he do? He picked himself up. He fell in the grass. So it didn't really hurt him too bad. And he came back to the top of the hill and says, all right, let's try it again. So I fired him back down the hill again. And I kept firing him down the hill. Over and over. And it took a long time. We were hours in there, weren't we? And all of a sudden, one time, he kind of got the hang of it. He almost, got to the bottom, just doing that little wobble thing, and managed to stop with his feet on the ground. He's like, I think I got it. And then he would get better and better and better, right? I'm a father teaching the son how to ride a bike. How much more so God, who says, return, try again. In our own lives. He'll keep firing us down the hill. He'll let us fall. Don't kid yourselves, friends. If you think following God is an easy life with no pain or no struggle, don't kid yourself. There's hard things to learn, and the way we learn them is through pain. But we're always allowed to return when we make a wrong choice. We have permission to try again. 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. You know what it doesn't say there? It doesn't say how many times you're allowed to do that. It doesn't say if you confess your sins 12 times He'll forgive you and after that forget about it. Does it? It doesn't say if you do it 382 times and then you've gone 1, 2, that's too many. Does it? There's no statute of limitations. There's no limit to God's grace, to His willingness to let us to return and try again. And that's really good news, friends, because when we think about how many of us make mistake after mistake after mistake every day of our lives, when you think about how many people, probably right in this very room, struggle with various kinds of addiction. Before you say you don't have one, anybody addicted to coffee? Right? The reality check is that we can always return. The lesson we learned from Abram's choice is when you make a mistake, don't think, oh, I'm a bad person and walk away from God. When you make a mistake, run back. Don't walk. Get back where you started and call on Him, and He will answer. That's what we learned from Abram's first choice. We learn we have permission to try again. We learn we have permission to learn from our mistakes. I found a really unexpected source of wisdom this week. I was reading through various ideas about choices and how we make choices, and I ran across a quote from Angelina Jolie. Some of you know who that is. She's a Hollywood action star and beautiful woman, and not the sort of person based on her movies that I would think, yeah, there's a source of found wisdom. Okay? Now, she's a good person. She actually does some good work in the world with the hungry and stuff. But nonetheless, she said this. Without suffering, we would never learn from our mistakes. To make it right, pain and suffering is the key to all windows. Without it, there is no way of life. Isn't that interesting? Even she gets that pain and suffering is how we learn. Even she understands, with all that she has and all the opportunities she has, that the way we grow is through making mistakes and learning from them. We have permission to return. What's more, if you remember the prodigal son story, my favorite part of that story is when the son comes back. Because you know what happens when he comes back? It's not Dad on the porch of the rocker going, "Oh boy, here comes the troubled one," is it? Do you know what Dad does in that story? Do you remember? He gets up and he runs to the boy. He knows what his son has done. He knows his son has nothing left that he was given or entrusted with. And yet he runs to him. Why? Because we have permission to try again, to learn from our mistakes and to return. Abram chooses to come back, to return to God, to make things right. And then he chooses to pursue peace. It's an interesting choice. Not because he likes peace, but because he's the one in charge. He's the senior guy in the family. He's the one that has the power and the authority to make any decision he wants. He could just tell Lot, "Get lost, buddy. This is my space." Abram's the one that God gave the land to, isn't he? Abram's the one that God said, "I'm going to give you this land to your family, to your descendants, and it's going to be your spot." Right? And so it's really interesting that Abram values peace at this point. And he said, "I don't want to be at odds with you, Lot." In verse 8 he says, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. He pursues peace. Now we all know peace is hard, right? I mean, peace is really hard, especially when you're wealthy. When you can have whatever you want, it's much easier to just say, "No, it's my way or the highway," isn't it? We've said that to our children a time or two, maybe. My way or the highway. I want you to notice something, and just as an aside, some people might say, "But look how well Abram's done. He went to Egypt, he gets rich, he comes back, and God blesses him," right? But I want you to notice what happens. Everything that he brought from Egypt goes back. Okay? If not for the wealth of Egypt that he brought back with him, he would not now be at odds with his nephew Lot. The reason they're fighting is there's not enough land for their herds to graze. Not enough wells and water holes for them to water their flocks and their families. The wealth of Egypt is not a benefit to Abram. It's actually a problem for him. I want you to notice that he was given servants when he was in Egypt, and one of those was a maidservant named Hagar that later creates problems in his marriage. And his nephew Lot, who went with him out of his homeland to this land that God would show him, his nephew Lot that was following God just like Abram, after he's been in Egypt, he's gotten bitten by the bug. He likes the nice stuff, the pretty present like Jackie brought for us. Right? And so when he's given the choice, what does he choose? He chooses the pretty and the beautiful without even looking beneath the surface to see what's there. And what he's going to get. He walks away from God and goes after what looks good. And Abram pursues peace. Because peace is God's plan. It says in James chapter 3, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And here's the promise. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And then Romans 12 verse 18, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Abram has a hard choice. He says, I want to be at peace with Lot. I love my nephew. I want him to do well. And so what does he do? He says, we can't be at peace if we stay together. Now that's an interesting choice, isn't it? Sometimes we think peace means I got to figure it out, I got to settle it. But it requires two people, A, that are willing to make peace, and it also requires a situation that's solvable. Sometimes the only solution is to get away. It's to make distance between you and the problem. And that's the way to have peace. And Abram chooses that. He chose first to return to God, demonstrating to us that we can return, and then he chooses peace as his priority, and the New Testament affirms that that's God's priority for us, that when we make our choices, we would choose a path that makes peace, that brings peace. And then he makes the third choice. And this is the one that still startles me. It still amazes me that Abram makes this choice, because as I said, he's the one that has the authority and power. He could just say, Lot, I want to be at peace with you, get out of here. Couldn't he? But he does exactly like Jackie's illustration. What a great way to illustrate it, Jackie. With those two gifts. He says, Lot, take a look at the land and you decide. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. We're not going to fight about it. Whatever you decide, I'm going to accept. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to try and persuade you to change your mind. I'm just going to go my own way and you go your way, and we'll have peace, right? Abram chooses the path of humility. He chooses to be humble. He chooses to let somebody else choose. Think about that for a minute. When we read Philippians 2 verse 3 and it says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves." Why is it we fight that so hard? It's got to be our way. It's got to be my choice. I want to decide. Abram learns a lesson that we need to learn, that when you trust and let others make the choice, that God will still provide. He receives a blessing out of this. He doesn't cop out when he made a priority on peace and lets Lot choose so that things can work out. Look at verse 14. Then the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are." And he's not in a very nice place, frankly, friends. Compared to where Lot went, Abram got the leftovers. But God says to him, "Look north. Look south. Look east and look west. My promise still stands. All the land that you see," verse 15, "I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted." I'm going to make you great, Abram. You chose humility, you chose peace. I'm going to bless you for that. I'm going to bless you and reward you. Abram returned. He chose peace and he humbled himself and he received a blessing. That's what good choices are all about. But I have to ask the question, why did he do that? What was the motivation? Because I don't know about you, but religion has never really motivated me a whole lot to do the right thing. The fact that I go to church every Sunday rarely has kept me from making mistakes. But I'll tell you what does. A man named Joshua Harrison, in a book I read recently, said it this way. He said, "Because Christian faith is not just a cultural tradition or a moral code. Faith is not just a state of mind, a mystical experience, or concepts on a page. God is real, and He has acted in our world. And His actions have meaning today and for all eternity." Listen to that again, just for a second. The Christian faith is not just a cultural tradition or a moral code. Faith is not just a state of mind, a mystical experience, or concepts on a page. God is real. And He has acted in our world, and His actions have meaning today and for all eternity. Abram understood this. Abram was not following some kind of religious law. There was no law when Abram answered God's call. Abram was not attending church every Sunday. There was no church or temple. Abram simply was listening to God and then doing his best to try and live according to what the God he knew would want. He was listening to God's Spirit speak to his spirit, and he was trying the best he could and learning as he went. Eventually we see the law come. Eventually we see formality and tradition come, and those have value. But without those, you can still know the Lord. Abram understood that God was God, that He was real, that He cared about his life. And because He did, he made choices which changed history. Imagine if Abram had chosen not to call on God. Imagine if he'd chosen not to return. Imagine if he'd chosen not to be a peacemaker. What might have happened? Friends, I know some people, I've talked to people, and I'm sure you have too, that say, "Why do you believe in that God stuff anyway? Isn't that a little naive to think that you can live this way? Isn't it a little juvenile or childish to believe that there's a God that will guard you and guide you?" The answer is absolutely not. Because since God is real, since He has poured Himself into our lives, we can know who He is, how He works, and what He has done. And we can make our choices according to that. We can make better choices. Because God is real, Abram chose a different path, and that changed everything. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard the statement from Robert Frost in his poem. And he said, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. We're on the road less traveled by, my friends. And for those of you that perhaps are not yet on that road, I invite you to try that road. I promise you it will make the difference. Whatever choice you are facing, whatever mistake you're trying to recover from, whatever situation is in front of you that leaves you feeling like you have no choice, like you've run out of options, I can promise you that if you return to God, that if you seek peace and humble yourself, that you will not only find God's blessing, you will find the right choice. Would you pray with me?